Welcome to The Sound of Economics, podcast by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, Head of Outreach and Governance here at Bruegel.
And I'm Guntram Wolf, I'm the Director of Bruegel.
And we are happy to welcome you for another episode of The Sound of Economics Live. We are live streaming this recording, and usually we would have an audience in the studio to interact with us. But given the circumstances of the coronavirus pandemic, we are recording this remotely connected from our respective homes. We nevertheless have an audience participating online. Our listeners can ask us questions by going to the website slide.do and typing the code #macro, all capital letters. And for this live recording session, we are happy to connect with Bruegel fellow Gregory Claes. Hi, Gregory. How are you?
Fine, and you?
Good. And from London, we have Lucrezia Rechlin, Professor of Economics at the London Business School. Hi, Lucrezia.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
As the COVID-19 pandemic intensifies and Europe has become one of its epicenters, this represents an unprecedented challenge for Europe's healthcare systems, but also a major shock for the continent's economy. The ECB, national fiscal authorities, and the European Commission have already started to announce plans to support the economy and avoid the current crisis turning into a depression. However, given the severity of the situation, some voices are raised among EU countries in support of a common and significant European response to deal with crisis. Many options are currently discussed in policy and academic circles: ESM credit lines, Corona bonds, a Euro area treasury, as well as a joint expenditures, just to name a few. We have seen that the European Council held on Thursday, 26 April, did not reach a conclusion on the matter, and that the Eurogroup has been mandated to make a proposal in the next 2 weeks. In this episode, we are going to explore all that and try to look at the questions of which are the best options on the table to deal with the crisis currently unfolding and ensure that the recovery will be as quick as possible. Guntram and Gregory have mapped out the various options in a blog post published on our website. Perhaps that can be a good starting point to explain to our listeners the status of the situation and the open options. Guntram.
Well, thank you, Giuseppe. I think our starting point in this blog post is really to say that this is a massive crisis. It leads to a massive drop in GDP. There's various estimates out there, but I think a nice number that one can easily remember is that every week of lockdown costs something like 1 percentage point of GDP. That may be higher or lower, we don't know. It might also increase, but it's very substantial. And so as the lockdown measures continue, GDP is essentially in free fall. And this creates massive problems for companies and individuals that basically do not have the means to just bridge several weeks or months without income. And they need support, and that support is fiscal support. And so I think our first point is really we need massive fiscal support programs to support companies and prevent a mass wave of bankruptcies going forward. Now, the question then becomes, how is that financed? And of course, it can only be financed by issuing debt. Governments, of course, have already announced significant programs with significant debt issuance happening. I think there's room for much more in some countries, including in Italy, where the crisis is very big, and the fiscal response, to my knowledge, is still comparatively small compared to the fiscal response. Now, the European debate is really about whether there should be some sort of burden sharing to be able to more easily manage this debt issuance. We, in the blog post with Gregory, we really discuss the various options that are on the table for doing so. I think perhaps the most important starting point is there that no matter what, for such huge expenditures that could easily be 10 percentage points of GDP as the lockdown continues, it is a good thing to one way or another have the debt at some stage in the balance sheet of the central bank. And in Europe, of course, the central bank is the European Central Bank. But that exactly makes it also toxic in the European context, because it's a European central bank, but we have national treasuries. And there's always the question, can the risk sharing be done implicitly, or should it be done explicitly through some sort of a special purpose vehicle, or the ESM getting parliamentary support? Now, I let Gregory perhaps explain the options in some more detail, but I personally think it's actually quite important that we do not let this only be the job of the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank needs massive political support for the major actions it takes. And I would prefer a solution where we have some sort of a European mechanism that is endorsed by the finance ministers and the national parliamentary procedures if necessary, so as to give political legitimacy to the kind of risk sharing we are doing. But again, I think a lot depends on the kind of options. But in the end, a lot of debt will have to end up one way or another in the balance sheets of the ECB. And we shouldn't worry about this. There's no inflationary risks in the current circumstances, in my view. Perhaps, Gregory, you want to explain a bit more?
Yeah, maybe I can go a bit more into the details of the different options, because one of the objectives of our blog post was also to clarify the current debate, because there are many proposals at the moment, and sometimes there is some misunderstanding on what people mean by Corona bonds, what people mean by ESM credit line, etc. So the first thing that we wanted to do is really map the different options, and we really see like 4 main different options, in order also to look at the pros and the cons of these various options. So basically, the first option that we consider in the blog post, and that should be considered by the European Council, is the status quo, basically, because now we already see that countries are already financing their own expenditure by themselves, and they are doing that by increasing by a lot national borrowing. And this is done, and this is actually supported by a massive European Central Bank purchases to ensure that that countries can maintain market access with a very cheap and a very easy way. So that's the first option, and that's what we are doing already at the moment. And it seems that for the moment it's working, but it might be insufficient in the future. The second option that we discuss in our blog post is to use traditional or slightly modified European Stability Mechanism credit lines. And this is actually what has been discussed in the Eurogroup on March 24, where they said that they would explore a kind of pandemic crisis support credit line that would be based on already pre-existing existing credit line at the ESM. So that's the second option, to use the ESM. And one of the advantages of that is that if a country uses an ESM credit line, it can also access the famous ECB OMT program, which allows the ECB to have unlimited and targeted asset purchase for a particular country. So that's the second option. And the third option is to create a debt management office for the Eurozone in order to put together all the borrowing related to the crisis. And this could be done either through a new agency, or this could be done also through a repurposed ESM that would borrow a massive amount of money and issue therefore a massive amount of bond of let's say 1 trillion euro. And this would have some advantages that we can discuss later. For instance, the fact that the ECB could buy these bonds much more easily and in a, let's say, legally sounder way than to buy unlimited amount of sovereign bonds. So that's the third option. And our first option that we discuss in our blog post is this idea to have one-off debt issuance of Corona bonds to finance common expenditure related to the crisis. So the main difference of that option is that basically the burden of the cost will be really shared on the whole community and on the whole monetary union. And it would act as an insurance against this exogenous shock that we face at the moment. And so it means that ex post, there would be direct transfers between countries because the countries that suffer more from the shock will receive more from such an insurance than the countries that suffer less. So those are the 4 options that we discuss in the blogs, and we can discuss, of course, what are the main advantages and issues of those options.
Thank you, Gregory. Lucrezia, what do you think about those options? And actually, the debate around the theme, as mentioned before, goes also beyond those 4 options. Perhaps there are other options on the table. What is your first reaction on this, and what is your feedback?
Yes, let me just first say that this is a very difficult issue for the euro area because although the euro bond idea, it might be the first best in such a catastrophic event like the coronavirus event. We have the problem that actually the union does not have a common fiscal capacity to guarantee this common debt. So this is not just a matter of solidarity, but is a matter of taking the political step of creating this common capacity, which is something that for the moment we do not have, and which requires an abnormal will from the political point of view. So whatever the options will be chosen at the end, and I remain optimistic that something will be done. This is not a matter of technical solution, but is a matter of a political will. Now, having said that, in the absence of a sufficient political will, there is a tendency, like we have seen in 2008, to say, well, the ECB will do the job. And I totally agree with Guntram that this will be very dangerous, because if this has to be a political choice of putting more things in common in our union, it has to be a political choice. So we cannot delegate to unelected officials such a choice. It is something that the citizens have to be with us, and so the political the politician will have to have the guts to go to their citizens and say, we are putting common resources on the table. Now, having said that, among the options, I've been the author of one of the possible solutions, which was a relatively moderate solution, which started from the idea that the first best at the moment is not possible. So that the first best for me would be the issuance of common bonds related to the objective, of relating, to coping with the crisis. So our solution was a second best solution and was based on the ESM, which it is the instrument that we have at the moment, the only instrument that we really have. So it is actually one of the options that Gregory described. So the idea is to have a special line for the ESM related to the cost of the coronavirus. So the disbursement would be related to the cost of the crisis. And, the advantage, and actually this will have to be a new line with a very light conditionality and for all countries, so to avoid the stigma attached. And you would have to be a loan with very long maturity. So at the moment, there is no agreement on this option, but this could be like a minimal step to go in the direction of some form of mutualization, because although the debt would remain national, countries will benefit from an interest rate which for most countries would be lower than market rate. Now, yes, I mean...
Yeah, I want to interrupt you to get to know a little bit what Guntram thinks about this option that you are just outlining.
No, I mean, I think, I mean, the debate currently is very polarized in the sense that the south of Europe thinks anything that hears and it looks like ESM is bad, while the north of Europe thinks anything, the northeast of Europe thinks anything that looks or sounds or smells like Eurobonds is bad. And so this is a very polarized debate. I mean, mechanically, and technically, the two can be quite comparable in the sense that the ESM issues debt, so that's a bond, and then disperses that money to its members, and the members, of course, have to pay an interest on that debt. And a Corona bond would be quite comparable in the sense that there would have to be a debt issuance office, and there would have to be someone paying for the interest. So you can't avoid the fact that any debt that will be issued on the Eurozone at the Eurozone level, one way or another, will imply some form of a burden on the Eurozone taxpayer. The question is whether the burden on the Eurozone taxpayer is a burden that gets symmetrically distributed according to capital keys across the entire Eurozone, or whether some countries actually pay slightly more and others slightly less. And I think that's the sort of the second stage of the debate. And if I may, if I may take an example from an existing federation, my beautiful home country, Germany, of course, when the German federal government issues debt, the taxpayers in Bavaria are just as much liable as the taxpayers in North Rhine-Westphalia. But the difference here is that there can be more benefits accruing to the Bavarians and less payments by the Bavarians, or vice versa. And I think in the Eurozone, to come to that level, which is in a sense our fourth options that Gregory described, would be a massive step further, which I think is actually very difficult to do, given that we do not have this kind of political will and political union. So my view is we will have to probably stick to something that quite relates to capital keys, but it would still be a huge step because we mutualize the interest rate risk, the spread risk, in an explicit fiscal authority, and not just indirectly through the ECB. And that's why I think we need something like this, and whether we call it ESM or whether we call it a special purpose vehicle based on Article 122, I think is in the end more a political symbol.
Okay. Let me get some of the questions that we are getting from our listeners on Slido, because the debate is starting to get to warming up on, as you say, very polarizing issue. So first of all, I wanted to, since we are in the ESM ball, I have Sebastiano who's asking regarding the ESM credit lines, conditionality aside, is OMT needed in this phase? And then he's saying PEP already covers potential sovereign debt risk with its large-scale purchase. And I might add the issue of conditionality. Maybe we want to spend a few words, because you've been mentioning about ESM being a possibility, but how to deal with the conditionality that is strings attached to the ESM. Who wants to reply to this?
Well, I will reply. I mean, I think that the issue of the reason why the proposal of the ESM, the proposal that Reglin put forward himself, or proposal like the ones we designed, did not go through, is exactly because the ESM was designed for something very different, and conditionality is very much part of the way in which these credit lines, the basis on which these credit lines are granted. So something which is based on very light conditionality, is a little bit controversial, and also because even if you would say, okay, conditionality would be related to the way in which you spend it. So spend it, only for a coronavirus type of purposes. That's kind of too general. It's not clear what it means. For certain countries, the cost will be larger, not only because of the incidence of the virus, but also because of pregress conditions on, the fragility of the banks or the corporate sector. So I think that this is the reason why, it would be actually much better to have a new concept with very light conditionality. And then, the first best indeed would be, like a data agency or something like that.
Lucrezia, if I may also follow up on this, but get another question from Stefan Tobias from Brussels, because he asks, and I think that not only him, but many people are asking this question at this moment in Europe, exactly why are Corona bonds not possible? Even in the Netherlands, he says, some voices are now supporting the idea.
Well, in the Netherlands, I think it's very interesting that it is the governor of the central bank which has supported, which has not exactly supported that idea, but it has hinted that it would support some idea of that kind. And it's the governor of the central bank, which is one of the most hawkish governors, because he's worried that the ECB otherwise would carry the burden. And so it's interesting that the central banker would rather go for coronavirus bonds rather than having the ECB doing the whole job. So I think that this is encouraging. So maybe what we need is both. Maybe we need an instrument like the ESM, which, in the worst case will declench the OMT. And then maybe at some point the time will be mature for having some point, hopefully in the very near future, to have a joint issues of debt for something which is narrowly defined, like, for example, a common purpose. Like everybody is talking about testing is very important to get Europe back to work at some point. And it's not done in a coordinated way. Maybe we want to have a joint issuance of debt in order to have a program like that, which is very well defined, is clearly important to keep the European market together. So maybe, the political will at some point converge to something like that. Okay, so joint issuance for a very specific and narrowly defined purpose.
Yeah. Perhaps let me just also react on 2 points. I think one important point that Lucrezia mentioned is this whole issue of conditionality. And indeed, the way the ESM was conceived was as a mechanism not to help all countries, but to help some countries and individual countries. And it's ingrained in the ESM treaty that this help always has to come with conditionality. Yep. So anything that sounds like ESM, of course, has this feature that in the current treaty, that it would be basically sort of a support program for specific countries with conditionality, and that's very controversial. And so I think when we talk about an ESM solution that is, as Lucrezia is proposing, is symmetric, so that every country receives money from the ESM. That's this COVID line idea. And there is some sort of light conditionality. I think it would still, first of all, it would still be conditionality, and that's controversial. And it would probably require some sort of an ESM treaty revision, especially if the conditionality becomes very light. Because my recollection is that in the German constitutional debate, when the ESM treaty was triggered, there was always this was created. There was always this very strong point: conditionality is a prerequisite for financial assistance. And so that's why, I mean, perhaps basing something on the legal basis, Article 122.2, which actually allows the EU to give support and grant support, could be legally easier. Then there's, of course, the technical difficulties. You need people who actually know how to create a bond and structure that and speak to the markets. And, you know, Klaus Regling and his people really know how to do this. So you might still want to rely technically on the same people, but you might want to have a different legal base. I mean, so I think that's what I would probably think. But Gregory,
No, I fully agree with you. And I think, yes, the ESM has the main advantage of being up and running and having some expertise on how to issue bonds, etc. It's already rated by rating agencies. It has a AAA, etc. So that's an advantage, of course. But it's true that conditionality is really in the heart of the ESM. I counted this morning in the ESM treaty, conditionality, condition, or conditional appears like 38 times. So it's going to be very difficult to do an ESM program without conditionality or with a very light conditionality. It's really in the soul of the ESM to have conditionality. So either we totally rewrite the ESM treaty, which is a possibility, or we create something else. And I would say the second argument against using the ESM is this relatively small size. In particular, if we want to do what Lucrezia and Guntram were saying, which is to have lines for everyone at the same time. Because for the moment, the firepower of the ESM is like 400 billion euros, which might not be enough compared to the size of the shock. Guntram was saying 10% of GDP for the whole Eurozone, so that's much higher. And actually, the proposal made by the Eurogroup was mentioning even 2% only of GDP. And if you do a credit line of 2% of GDP for Italy, in the end, it's like 35 billion euros. And the gain would be quite small because Italy actually at the moment paid like 1.4% interest rate. Even if that is decreased to zero, this would amount to like basically not much saving, like 0.03% of GDP, of Italian GDP. So for the moment, it's too small to really be helpful. So we need to change the legal base as well as the size, I think, if we want this tool to be used.
If I may get back to our listeners and some of the questions, there is Antonella who is saying that Lucrezia is describing a special purpose bond. Well, not only Lucrezia, but I think that it's in discussion also with Gregory and Guntram. We have the example of green bonds that the EU is supporting. EU knows how to do that. I'm not sure that this is exactly the case at the moment. So maybe we can explain to our listeners the difference or what exactly is there.
Go ahead if you want.
No, go ahead. But
I think it's a very different issue. Green bonds would be issued by either by companies or by funds or even by government. But for the moment, there is no project of issuing common European green bonds here. With coronavirus, we are really talking about issuing bonds in common. That's the most important. For the moment, the discussion on green bonds is really on the taxonomy, on what a green bond is, when it will be issued by the private sector or by the sovereigns, but there is no discussion on issuing that in common.
So the specificity of this Corona bond, of the Euro bond that we are thinking about in this contest is that, it's a bond that will be guaranteed by, the tax capacity of the entire union. And, this is something that we have never done, and that, it's maybe at some point, if we want to keep the integrity of the union, we'll have to go there, but it doesn't seem that so far there is a political will to go in that direction. But if I can go back of what I was describing before, I think that perhaps, if you think of what is really a European public good, okay, so one problem of why there is no no political will to go towards mutualization is because there is this idea that some countries have, higher public debt, and so they will, would be huge beneficiaries of some, of some kind of Eurobond. But maybe we could have a joint issuance for something which is a clearly European public good. So if I think in the context of coronavirus, what is a really public good? Is the idea to put together a system for testing widely, in Europe, every citizens, randomly, from the European population, independently of where are the country, where is the countries of nationality. And this would be very important to allow, people to go back to work and to avoid a Balkan, so the disruption of the single market, because if countries do it differently and have different strategy to go back to work, then the frontiers will have to be closed. And this will be, a distraction of the most obvious public good that we have, which is the single market. So if we can define a purpose which is clearly, has a European connotation, like, for example, the capacity to test people, maybe a financial instrument can be, the political agreement to, to support such a financial instrument maybe can be found.
I mean, if I can just add on this, I mean, I think it's an important point to focus on the public good nature and sort of focus on what we all benefit from a joint response. I mean, this is not just about supporting the countries with a bigger debt burden. It's about creating something that will increase the stability of the system. And I think the health dimension that you mentioned, Lucrezia, is one important dimension, but I think we should go beyond the health dimension. I would probably also emphasize the fact that there are, of course, major demand and supply, sorry for the jargon, externalities between countries. I mean, if the Italian economy and the Italian finance ministry provides an insufficient fiscal response because it fears the penalties in the markets, we might end up actually losing a significant amount of Italian companies, which will not only be a problem for the companies across the Eurozone that actually rely on the supply chains from these Italian companies, Bavarian companies, but it will also be a problem because in the end, the debt to GDP burden of Italy may be higher than it would have been with a more significant fiscal response, because basically GDP is permanently collapsing. So in my view, I mean, this is really the fiscal response we need has clearly a Eurozone cross-border dimension and needs to be coordinated and needs to be significant and big. And if I look at the numbers that I'm currently seeing on the fiscal response, I notice that it's very different across countries. And I notice that some Italian numbers that the Italian numbers, compared to the fact that Italy is already more advanced in this crisis than in this health crisis than Germany and France are relatively small. So I think we really have here demand and supply externalities well beyond the health sector, and that's why I think we need some form of coordination and a stronger European response. But perhaps I'm
on this, I have a question, because you mentioned, Guntram, that the fiscal response of Italy is much less comparing to other countries. But I wonder if this is not only linked to the momentum now and the capacity of spending now, but also about the fact that the fiscal capacity of a country like Italy is less in general than of a country like Germany. So to a certain extent, we can say to the Italians, you can spend more in this moment, but if the capacity and the structural capacity is not there, then that's why the Italians might look at European solutions for that circumstance. That's at least how I interpret the numbers of the relatively low fiscal response, like comparing to the other countries at the moment, between Germany or like even other countries outside Europe. That could also be interesting to make a comparison about the fiscal stimulus of the United States, for example, and what is happening at the moment in general in Europe. I mean, if there are some similarities, some lessons to be learned, or like some reflections that we might have to make on this, because
we have already learned the lesson in 2008. Countries with lower fiscal capacity, are constrained, and Italy is constrained. And I think that this is the externality that Guntram was talking about. However, as we know, this is controversial. I mean, we are talking about, finding political consensus here. I would be totally in agreement of having a fantastic Eurobond, and but that we have to face reality. So that's why I think that the health situation and guaranteeing the Schengen space, I think it's a very clean argument, which is cleaner than the fact that the externality due to the fact that some countries have less fiscal capacity to spend. Because the German, I mean, I don't have to tell this to a German like Gunther, that the German's objection to that is that exactly, okay, so that, they build that in good times, so now, they should be punished. So, so let's start from what could be consensual, and I think that everybody agrees that we should keep Schengen going, and then to keep Schengen going, we need to have testing capacity, and so that we can send some people back to work. And I think on that there is a large consensus from both the science part and the economics part. And then maybe at some point there will be enough trust to do more.
Lucrezia, can I ask you on a different, slightly going in a different direction, on the ECB more specific? There is now a debate, and you of course have worked at the ECB at some stage in a very senior position, and so I would love to hear your views on the ECB and the likely consequences of a major ECB program. I mean, the PEP program is 750 billion. Now, if you try to explain this to a citizen on the street, they really don't understand these numbers. And I mean, I talk a lot with journalists trying to explain that this is a number that's reasonable. But a lot of people ask me, isn't this going to generate immediately a lot of inflation, and what's the role of the ECB here? Isn't this a huge problem for the ECB? And I personally think it's probably not, and I don't think it's going to create a lot of inflationary pressure, because we are in a low inflation environment, and the inflation numbers still look extremely muted, and I haven't seen an increase but rather a decrease. But I mean, there could be some inflationary pressure at some stage if we beef up this program or not. I mean, where do you see this?
Well, I think that, frankly, this program is the right thing to do. We need, some, coordination between monetary and fiscal policy. So, I mean, the monetary, we have the monetary at least. I think this is in line with what other countries are doing, the UK and the US. We need the central bank ammunition to, provide liquidity and also, to keep financial conditions, relatively favorable for countries which are stressed. So it would be a disaster if the ECB had not gone this way. The ECB has a lot of space to do that, because inflation, as we know, is much, much lower than target. And it will have as much, space until inflation remains below target, because in the treaty, the inflation target has, has a hierarchical position, okay, about the different objectives of the ECB, so that the ECB is committed to keep inflation around 2%. And so I think, of course, as the economy recovers, so I'm talking about, not now, but in the future, if the economy recovers and there is supply capacity constraints because of the disruption of production capacity due to the fact that, the economy has been locked in for a long time, then it is conceivable that there will be some sign of inflation. And then at that point, the ECB will have to withdraw. I mean, we know that now the ECB has several instruments, and has several instruments, so that that has also the possibility of withdrawing. Okay, but and this is why actually we need fiscal, because you know, at that point the ECB will be really constrained by the treaty, and so we really need to have the fiscal tool to step in, and you know, politicians to take their responsibilities on the management of aggregate demand.
I have a reflection, Letizia, from Stavros, Lucrezia, sorry. He said, isn't there a difference if Corona bonds are used to promote EU-wide testing as opposed to Corona bonds to help one country, as the former would be a joint EU project? Because you mentioned the testing and in that kind of frame.
I think, you know, it will be there will be a stronger case for joint issuance of bond if it is for a European purpose. Now, you know, the solidarity with, you know, for example, with respect to Italy, you know, you can have it also at the bilateral level. Now you can have loans, you know, you can have, you know, transfers. So not everything has to be done with common European instruments. I think actually we are facing a situation where there is a very, very strong motivation to use common European instruments because of what Gutram said, the externalities. But you know, we are not we are not in a union, a fiscal union, in which you know, if one region suffers, then the other region you know, goes and supported it, because we do not have the legitimacy of having a political union and the taxpayers' consensus for doing something like that. While I think it would be easier to explain to the European taxpayers from the North and the South that we have to put joint effort, that we have to have a joint effort in order to protect what is common.
Can I ask, there's two questions on Slido that I would love us to discuss very quickly, and because we don't have that much time, but one is on, you know, how do we ensure, is a question unfortunately by Mr. Anonymous, how do we ensure that after this we return to sustainable debt levels and competitive economies when we give an ESM credit line with only light conditionality focused on Corona? Lucrezia, is sustainability an issue, and how do we ensure that this long-term sustainability is there?
Sustainability depends more or less by the difference between the capacity of a country to grow and the rate at which the debt is financed. So we know from you know, from textbook economics that you know, the budget constraints of a state it's intertemporal. So of course we have to think about this sustainability, you know, thinking in an intertemporal sense, and so looking at what is the future capacity for the country in question to grow in relation to the rate at which the debt is financed. And if these loans are used to reconstruct, I think that you know, the sustainability numbers will be favorable, especially if the ECB is there to guarantee you know, low interest rate.
Can I ask another question to Gregory, Giuseppe, which is also by Anonymous? It says, if Italy profits only little from an ESM line of 2% of GDP, because it pays only 1.4% interest currently in the markets, why can't Italy borrow at 1.4? This is much less than during the Eurozone crisis. Why can they not just go themselves on the markets?
Oh, they can do it themselves, and that's the beauty of the current of the status quo, is that thanks to the ECB, who has really decreased actually the spread, because the spread actually, before the PEP was announced, the spread were shooting up. Now interest rates are at 1.4, and Italy can issue as much debt as it wants. So I think for the moment there is no problem with that. It's true that it would help if instead of borrowing at 1.4, it would borrow at 0, like the ESM would do. It would be helpful, but marginal, but it would still be helpful. And maybe to come back to what Lucrezia was saying, I think this is the right question: is what do we do after? Because many significant countries of the Eurozone might have debt to GDP ratio above 150%. It can be Italy, of course, but it could also be Spain or even France or Belgium. So many countries might end up in that solution. And it means that we will have to discuss what Guntram mentioned in his introduction, which is how do we ensure that the interest rate paid on this debt remains low. And as Guntram was saying, I think one of the solutions is that a part of this debt, or at least the debt that has been issued during the crisis, remain on the books of the ECB and on the balance sheet of the ECB for a very long time, if not forever.
Yeah. I would like to have a last question. We haven't touched the politics so much, and also a little bit on purpose in this podcast, but we received a question that I think has to be at least mentioned towards the end of our conversation by another anonymous, which is about the role of the current situation in potentially giving new powers to populist parties. We've been seeing what has been going on in the Hungarian parliament in those days, and the tones of discussions might continue to rise in different parts of Europe. So this is a very important discussion that we are having in terms of solutions that are feasible within the institutional frames, what can be done, what cannot be done on the economic terms. Let's not forget that we're living into a quite peculiar political situation as well. So just to conclude this round of thoughts on this, how can we ensure that that this situation is not going to get out of hands in terms of raising populist parties and give them more powers in different member states?
I can tell you one thing, that if you ask for a memorandum of understanding, a tough conditionality as a prerequisite for loans, that is the clear route to populist parties, in Southern Europe.
Yeah, and if I can add on this, I mean, the explanation of populism is, of course, extremely complex. But I've never bought into the story that populism in the north of Europe is driven by the Eurozone and by sort of the previous rescue programs and this kind of stuff. In fact, the German right-wing populist party Alternative für Deutschland, I mean, they never thrived on the Eurozone topic. They were always well below 5% or around 5%. They thrived on the migration topic. And so my gut feeling is, also looking at the debate, also in the Netherlands, is that there's actually a lot of people that have a very nuanced and differentiated view on this idea of Corona bonds, and the perception that the Netherlands, for example, is completely monolithic is completely wrong. I mean, as Lucrezia mentioned, Klaas Nott's intervention. There's many people in the Netherlands themselves that are actually annoyed by the harsh reactions of their own government to this extraordinary health crisis that really affects us all. And I can certainly say in my country, in Germany, we see a lot of debate on these Corona bond or different solutions. So I personally don't see this, if there was an agreement to jointly do something, that this would give rise to all of a sudden a major increase in the populist party's share in Germany. On the contrary, currently it's actually the Christian Democrats that seem to be doing really well in this crisis. So I don't know. I mean, so again, I think populism is extremely complex to understand, but overall, I think the Eurozone dimension to populism, I think it was an overstated proposition in the north of Europe. But I agree with Lucrezia in the south. If there's nothing, it could be, and if there's strong conditionality, it would really be a big mistake, because it would really give rise to a lot of bad sentiments towards Europe.
Gregory, a last word from you on this?
Oh, I fully agree with what was being said. I think it's a good summary.
Great. Well, in that case, if we don't have any other things to add, of course, we can go on and on discussing this for much longer, because the topic is not concluded and it's ongoing. And definitely we are going to continue here at the Sound of Economics at Bruegel in the next days to publish analysis and keep going on our debates. So in that case, I would like to thank for our listeners and all the participants that joined remotely and actively asked questions for this session. And thank you, Lucrezia, for joining us. Thank you, Gregory and Guntram. And you may find a blog post that was mentioned before by Gregory and Guntram on the very same issue that we discussed today on the Sound of Economics Live on our website, www.bruegel.org, alongside other podcasts and publications, both on the COVID-19 crisis, as well as many other economic topics. Stay tuned with the Sound of Economics. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.